The first chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Nexus explores the metaphysical anchor of the world of demon souls, the sanctuary that exists in the blind spot of reality. While the 5 archstones represent the body of the kingdom, the Nexus is its spine. It is a vertical cathedral of endless stairs and flickering candles, suspended above a fathomless void of fog. The lore of this era is the lore of the celestial limbo. The purpose of the Nexus was the containment of the scourge. It was built by the ancient Monumentals to serve as a binding seal for the Old One, ensuring that the beast could never truly wake or truly sleep. The history of the Nexus is the history of the architecture of the soul, where stone was enchanted to trap the spirit, turning a temple of worship into a prison for the living and the dead. The lore of the Great Binding provides the ancient foundation for the temple's existence. Centuries before King Allant XII, the world was nearly consumed by a previous deep fog. The survivors, the Monumentals, realized that the Old One could not be killed, only anchored. They sacrificed their physicality to become living pillars, weaving the Nexus into the fabric of the cosmos. The purpose of the Nexus is to act as a psychic dam. It holds back the colorless fog from the rest of the world by concentrating it into a single point. This reveals the strategic cruelty of the world's survival. The Nexus is a lure for souls, designed to feed the beast just enough to keep it sedate. The rise of the Nexus was the death of the natural afterlife, replacing the final rest with an infinite vigil. The physical environment of the Nexus, with its spiraling heights and bottomless pit, provides insight into the atmospheric despair of the fall. The architecture is designed to make the individual feel insignificant. The verticality serves as a hierarchical filter. The highest reach holds the history of the world through the Monumentals, while the lowest floor holds the source of the nightmare in the form of the Old One's lair. This was the era of the eternal suspension. It reveals the observational purpose of the temple. The soul is measured and stored like grain in a silo. The Nexus doesn't heal the slayer. It processes them, turning their will into fuel for the seal. The relationship between the central chamber and the 5 archstones represents the metastasis of the kingdom. Each stone is a tentacle of the Nexus reaching out to the farthest corners of the north. The archstones are extraction ports. They allow the Nexus to siphon the essence of the fractured realms. This shows that the history of the Nexus is a history of the vampire, where the center sucks the life from the periphery to maintain the status quo. The rise of the Archstone network was the end of the world's borders, creating a labyrinth where every path leads back to the same cold stone. The act concludes with the chilling realization that the Slayer is soulbound. Once the hunter enters the Nexus, their physical body is discarded, and they become a phantom of the temple. The purpose of the Nexus was to be the universal archive. It claims the hero so that history can be recorded in the candles that line the endless walkways. The Slayer understands that they are no longer human. They are a moving piece in a cosmic chess game played by the withered children of the Spire. The legacy of the Nexus in this chapter is the horror of the permanent limbo, where safety is the price of identity, and the sanctuary is the grave of the future. The second chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Nexus centers upon the silent sovereignty of the most enigmatic figure within the temple's stone embrace, the Maiden in Black. While the Nexus provides the body of the sanctuary, she provides its soul, acting as the bridge between the Slayer's human frailty and the eldritch might required to challenge the fog. The lore of this era is the lore of the demon gatekeeper. Her purpose was the mediated corruption. She is the only being capable of touching the demon in the soul without being consumed by it. The history of the Maiden is the history of the waxed eyes of the void, where a being of infinite power has been blinded and chained by duty, serving as the nanny of the apocalypse who nurses the champions of the Monumentals on the milk of the fallen. The lore of the primordial demon provides the terrifying truth behind her origin. The Maiden in Black is not human. nor was she ever a saint of the church in the traditional sense. The lore suggests that she is one of the oldest and most powerful demons ever spawned by the Old One during the first scourge. Her purpose was the subjugated evil. Unlike the archdemons who sought to devour the world, she was tamed or covenanted by the ancient Monumentals to serve as the engine of the soul arts. This reveals the pragmatic blasphemy of the Nexus. The forces of good are using a demon to kill demons. The rise of the maiden was the acceptance of the taint, proving that the only way to combat the fog is to invite it into the heart of the sanctuary. This shows that the history of the maiden is a history of the leash, where the greatest enemy is forced to become the greatest ally. The physical appearance of the maiden, her tattered black robes and her eyes waxed shut, provides insight into the ritualistic sensory deprivation of the fall. The lore of the blindness of the soul explains that her eyes were sealed to prevent her from gazing upon the temptations of the fog. Her purpose was the preservation of the neutrality. By closing her eyes to the material world, she remains focused entirely on the flow of the souls. This was the era of the dark internalization. This reveals the aesthetic of the sacrifice inherent in the Nexus. To serve the world, one must relinquish the light. This shows that the history of the maiden is a history of the void, where she sees the hunter's spirit not as a face, but as a pulsing mass of energy that must be refined and stored. The relationship between the maiden and the soul arts represents the industrialization of the spirit. She is the only entity who can level the slayer, converting the echoes of the slain into physical and mental attributes. The lore suggests that she is processing the blood of the kingdom. Her purpose was the alchemical refinement. She takes the raw, bestial power of the archdemons and filter it through her own demonic nature until it is safe for a human to consume. This reveals the metabolizing purpose of the fall. The maiden is the gizzard of the Nexus, grinding down the hardened souls of the archstones so the hero can digest them. This shows that the history of the maiden is a history of the digestion, where growth is just a byproduct of the demon's hunger. Furthermore, the lore of the maiden's lullaby, the mantra she speaks during the leveling process, represents the hypnotic pacification of the slayer, as she says, "Soul of the lost, withdrawn from its vessel, let strength be granted, so the world might be mended." She is casting a spell of obedience. The lore of the mending lie suggests that her purpose is the moral justification of the harvest. She packages the theft of souls as a noble necessity. This reveals the propaganda purpose of her role. She is the gentle face of a genocidal system. This was the era of the soft chains. The history of the maiden is the history of the sedation, where the slayer is convinced that they are mending the world, while they are actually just feeding the seal. The lore of the maiden's freedom, or the lack thereof, represents the infinite imprisonment of the gatekeeper. She is bound to the Nexus as surely as the Monumentals. The lore suggests that she yearns for the slumber as much as the Old One does. Her purpose was the eternal vigilance. She cannot die and she cannot leave. She can only wait for a champion strong enough to end the cycle. This reveals the tragic integrity of her character. She is a demon who has chosen to suffer eternally to keep the world from ending. This shows that the history of the maiden is a history of the martyrdom, where the monster is the only thing holding the universe together with her wax-sealed hands. The relationship between the maiden and the Old One's heart represents the final invitation. At the end of the journey, it is she who leads the slayer into the deep to face the source. The lore suggests that she is the Old One's favorite daughter and its final jailer. Her purpose was the lullaby of the end. She is the only one who can sing the beast back to sleep. This reveals the symphonic purpose of the fall. The entire scourge was a cacophony that only the maiden can resolve into silence. This was the era of the final note. The history of the maiden is the history of the conductor, who orchestrates the rise and fall of kingdoms from the cold stone floor of the Nexus. The act concludes with the silent interaction between the maiden and the candles of the temple. She is often seen tending the flames that represent the souls of the living. The purpose of the maiden in black was to be the keeper of the light in the dark. She is the warmth that hides the cold truth. The Slayer realizes that without her, the Nexus would be an empty husk, and the hunter would be a maddened beast. The rise of the Gatekeeper's influence is the final comfort of the damned, proving that even in a world without gods, there is still a demon who cares. The legacy of the Maiden in Black in this chapter is the horror of the mediated corruption. We realize that salvation is a dirty business that requires the service of the vile. The purpose of the workshop of the Maiden was to make the demon useful, and the fall was the shattering of the vision. As the Slayer kneels before the blind woman, feeling the soul energy flowing through her cold fingers, they understand that the history of the Maiden is the history of the shadow, a shadow that protects the world by consuming the light from the inside out. The third chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Nexus ascends to the highest balconies of the temple to confront the withered divinity of the Monumentals. These are the architects of the seal, the last remnants of an ancient civilization that sacrificed its humanity to become the metaphysical foundations of the world. While the Maiden in Black is the active force of the Nexus, the Monumentals are its passive memory. The lore of this era is the lore of the living pillars. Their purpose was the existential preservation. They are the gilded cages of the human spirit, existing in a state of eternal half-life to prevent the universe from collapsing into the deep. The history of the Monumentals is the history of the memory of the first scourge, where progress was exchanged for stasis, and the future of mankind was entombed in the bodies of withered children. The lore of the Great Sacrifice provides the harrowing foundation for the Monumentals' physical forms. Looking upon them, the Slayer sees only small, childlike figures wrapped in golden shrouds, sitting in rows of silence. The lore suggests that these were once the greatest sages and kings of a world before the Northern Kingdom even existed. When the first scourge threatened to delete reality, these individuals relinquished their egos and bonded their souls to the stones of the Nexus. Their purpose was the weight of the world. They became the ballast that keeps the ship of existence from tipping into the fog. This reveals the mausoleum purpose of the Nexus. It is not a temple of life, but a museum of the living dead. The rise of the Monumentals was the end of the individual, proving that order requires the complete erasure of the self. The physical appearance of the last Monumental, the only one who still speaks, provides insight into the aesthetic of the atrophy of the fall. He is petrified, his skin resembling dry parchment, and his voice sounding like the rustling of dead leaves. The lore of the fragmented record explains that his purpose is the verbal continuity. He is the only bridge between the modern corruption of Allant and the ancient wisdom of the seal. This was the era of the crumbling history. This reveals the pedagogical purpose of the Nexus. The Monumental must teach the Slayer why the world is worth saving, even as he rots before their eyes. This shows that the history of the Monumentals is a history of the echo, where truth is diluted by the immensity of the centuries. The relationship between the Monumentals and the broken archstone, the land of the giants, represents the strategic amputation of the fall. The lore suggests that the Monumentals were the ones who severed the connection to the Sixth Kingdom when it became incurable. Their purpose was the cold calculation. They sacrificed millions to save billions. This reveals the utilitarian horror of the Nexus's management. The Monumentals do not love humanity, they balance it. This shows that the history of the Monumentals is a history of the scalpel, where the sages became butchers of kingdoms to protect the heart of the seal. The rise of the broken stone was the final admission that total victory is a fallacy. Furthermore, the lore of the souls of the brave represents the mercenary morality of the Monumentals. They summon heroes from across the fog, binding them to the Nexus and stripping them of their freedom. The lore of the hero processing suggests that the Monumentals view the Slayer as a resource rather than a person. Their purpose was the generation of the weapon. They provide the sanctuary only because they need a sword to lull the old one. This reveals the vampiric purpose of the Nexus's leadership. The Monumentals feed on the heroism of the living to prolong their own half-dead vigil. This was the era of the exploited spirit. The history of the Monumentals is the history of the tether, which pulls the hero toward martyrdom for a cause they do not understand. The lore of the final monumental suicide, represented by the rows of silent, dead figures, represents the slow death of the hope. For every silent statue in the upper ring, a history has been lost. The lore suggests that they are running out of time. Their purpose was the delaying of the inevitable. One by one, the pillars are cracking. This reveals the obsolescence purpose of the fall. The Nexus is failing. This was the era of the final candle. This shows that the history of the Monumentals is a history of the decay, where the architects have become dust and the seal has become brittle. The rise of the lone speaker is the final sob of an extinct universe. The relationship between the Monumentals and the moral choice, the soul of the Monumental, represents the final test of the Slayer. At the end of the journey, the Monumental expects the Slayer to take his place as a new pillar. The lore suggests that the good ending is actually the continuation of the imprisonment. Their purpose was the selection of the replacement. This reveals the pyramid scheme of the cosmos. The Nexus requires a constant stream of martyrs to stay afloat. This was the era of the eternal replacement. The history of the Monumentals is the history of the trap, where saving the world means becoming a statue in a cold, silent room. The act concludes with the silent gaze of the last Monumental looking down upon the Nexus floor. He watches the maiden, the Slayer, and the broken survivors, seeing them all as temporary shadows. The purpose of the Monumentals was to be the immutable law of the seal. They are the ice that freezes the deep. The Slayer realizes that these children are more ancient than the mountains, and their compassion is as cold as the void they guard. The rise of the Monumentals' request is the final binding of the hero's fate, proving that in the Nexus, life is just a stone waiting to be carved. The legacy of the Monumentals in this chapter is the horror of the withered divinity. We realize that safety is a mausoleum built by sages who forgot how to dream. The purpose of the workshop of the memory was to store the past, and the fall was the loss of the meaning. As the Slayer departs from the upper balcony, hearing the dry, hollow breath of the last sage behind them, they understand that the history of the Monumentals is the history of the wall, a wall that keeps the beast out, but keeps the world in a state of permanent grief. The fourth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Nexus shifts its focus from the celestial architects to the mortal detritus, the survivors who have found refuge within the temple's cold embrace. While the Monumentals represent the macro-history of the fall, figures like Stockpile Thomas and Blacksmith Boldwin represent the micro-history of domestic despair. These are the material remnants, individuals who have lost their homes, their families, and their sanity to the fog, clinging to the physicality of the object to prevent their spirits from dissolving. The lore of this era is the lore of the obsession of the craft. Their purpose was the psychological anchoring of the commoner. By sorting the loot and pounding the steel, they provide a rhythm of normality in a world where time and space have lost all meaning. The history of the survivors is the history of the burden of the possessions, where hoarding and labor become the only shields against the nihilism of the deep. The lore of the refugee's shame provides the harrowing emotional foundation for Stockpile Thomas. When the Slayer first encounters him, Thomas is a man broken by cowardice. He fled the Boletarian palace as the demons arrived, leaving behind his wife and daughter to be consumed by the shadows. The lore suggests that his hoarding is a pathological compensation. His purpose was the preservation of the tangible. Because he could not hold on to his family, he now holds on to everything else. He protects the Slayer's junk as if it were sacred relics. This reveals the restorative purpose of the Nexus survivors. They turn the trash of the world into the identity of the self. The rise of Stockpile Thomas was the birth of the Archivist of Grief, proving that love can be sublimated into the categorization of the Oregon. The physical environment of the blacksmith's corner provides insight into the industrial resignation of the fall. Baldwin and his brother Ed exist in a state of grudging service. They beat the iron not for glory, but because iron is the only thing that does not lie. The lore of the material certainty explains that their purpose is the sharpening of the survival. In a world of illusion and fog, the spark of the anvil is the only true light. This was the era of the hardened heart. This reveals the mechanical purpose of the Nexus's population. The blacksmiths are the internal cogs of the hero machine. They feed the war because the war is the only customer left in a dead market. This shows that the history of the blacksmiths is a history of the friction, where steel is ground down until it is as thin and brittle as the human soul. The relationship between the survivors and the soul-starved despair represents the social erosion of the Nexus. Thomas and Baldwin are safe from the demons, but they are rotting from the inside. The lore suggests that they are losing their memories of the outside world. Their purpose was the maintenance of the facade. They play at being a shopkeeper or a smith to distract themselves from the fact that they are prisoners. This reveals the anesthetic purpose of the Nexus. It is a waiting room where the occupants perform useless tasks to ignore the screams of the deep. This was the era of the busy ghost. The history of the survivors is the history of the habit, where routine replaces reason and work replaces hope. Furthermore, the lore of the jade hair ornament represents the relinquishing of the past. When the Slayer finds the ornament belonging to Thomas's daughter in the mire of the palace and returns it to him, he experiences a moment of devastating clarity. The lore of the returned trauma suggests that healing is forbidden in the Nexus. By giving him back his memory, the Slayer breaks his defense. His purpose shifted from hoarder to witness of the void. This reveals the cruel purpose of the Nexus's sanctuary. It only works if you forget what you are missing. This shows that the history of the survivors is a history of the amnesia, where sanity is bought with the currency of forgetting. The lore of the dull gold ore and the blacksmith's competition represents the greed of the remnant. Baldwin and Ed crave the rare minerals of the archstones. The lore suggests that their craft is infected by the soul hunger of the fog. Their purpose was the alchemical obsession. They want to forge a weapon that can kill a god, not to save the world, but to prove that their art is superior. This reveals the ego-driven purpose of the Nexus's labor. Even at the end of the world, man is competitive and prideful. This was the era of the petty divinity. The history of the blacksmiths is the history of the hammer, which crushes the truth to shape the vanity. The relationship between Stockpile Thomas and the Slayer's inventory represents the burden of the legacy. As the Slayer dumps more bloody armor and broken swords into Thomas's care, Thomas grows in status. The lore suggests that he is building a monument of refuse. His purpose was the burden of the history. He is the trash can of the cosmos, storing the evidence of every failure. This reveals the archaeological purpose of his role. When the world ends, Thomas will be the only one who knows what was left behind. This was the era of the final inventory. The history of Thomas is the history of the weight, where the heavier the pile, the lighter the man. The act concludes with the silent staring of the survivors as the Slayer departs for the fog. They watch the hero with a mixture of envy and pity. The purpose of Stockpile Thomas and the blacksmiths was to be the human background of the apocalypse. They are the lesser souls who support the great soul. The Slayer realizes that these mortal remnants are more terrifying than the Monumentals, for they show what happens to a human being when reason is replaced by storage. The rise of the Nexus market is the final irony of the All-Ant Fall, proving that even when the sun is eaten, there will still be someone selling the nails for the coffin. The legacy of the survivors in this chapter is the horror of the material remnants. We realize that obsession is a form of possession that keeps the heart beating while the mind is dead. The purpose of the workshop of the craft was to build a wall of objects, and the fall was the rusting of the will. As the Slayer leaves the clanging of the anvil behind, hearing the soft, pathetic thank you of Stockpile Thomas echoing in the endless hallways, they understand that the history of the survivors is the history of the anchor, an anchor made of broken iron and stolen ribbons that holds the spirit in the puddle of the past. The fifth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Nexus confronts the psychological attrition of the sanctuary through its most tragic resident, the crestfallen warrior. While the other inhabitants of the temple cling to a craft or a duty, the man in the blue armor represents the pure exhaustion of the human spirit. He is the avatar of the quitter, a former hero who reached the limits of his will and decided to sit down and wait for the end. The lore of this era is the lore of the fading spark. His purpose was the existential warning. He exists to show the Slayer that determination is a finite resource, and that the Nexus is not just a refuge, but a drain that slowly siphons the motivation out of the soul. The history of the crestfallen warrior is the history of the psychological decay, where the blue light of the spirit is eaten by the gray shadows of the stone. The lore of the heroic burnout provides the harrowing backstory for his current state of lethargy. Long before the Slayer arrived, this warrior was likely a knight of renown who entered the fog with fire in his eyes and justice in his heart. The lore suggests that he saw too much. He witnessed the infinite resurgence of the demons and the futility of the monumental cycle. His purpose shifted from combatant to cynic. This reveals the corrosive purpose of the Nexus. It breaks the strongest wills by exposing them to the vastness of the void. The rise of the crestfallen warrior was the birth of the defeated wisdom, proving that knowledge in the Northern Kingdom is a poison that paralyzes the limbs. He is the mirror in which the Slayer sees their own potential failure. The physical posture of the warrior, slumped against the central archstone with his head bowed, provides insight into the gravity of the despair within the fall. He mumbles his contempt for the maiden and the monumental, mocking the Slayer's ambition with a hollow laugh. The lore of the sarcastic resignation explains that his purpose is the verbal sabotage. He tries to infect the new hero with his own apathy so that he won't be alone in his cowardice. This was the era of the shared nihilism. This reveals the social friction of the Nexus. Misery seeks company to justify its surrender. This shows that the history of the crestfallen warrior is a history of the static, where progress is noise and sitting still is the only rational act. The relationship between the warrior and the blue phantom aura represents the draining of the vitality. In the Nexus, he is a spirit, yet he is dimmer than the others. The lore suggests that he is dissolving into the ether of the temple. His purpose was the demonstration of the attrition. He shows that if a soul stays in the Nexus for too long without purpose, it begins to evaporate. This reveals the metabolic cruelty of the sanctuary. The stone feeds on the idol. This was the era of the vaporizing identity. The history of the warrior is the history of the shadow, which grows fainter with every hour spent staring at the candles. The rise of his transparency was the final sign that his humanity had resigned. Furthermore, the lore of the warrior's final departure represents the inevitability of the hollow. Eventually, the warrior can no longer endure the self-loathing of his inaction. He vanishes from the Nexus, only to reappear as a mindless, soul-starved ghoul in the Boletarian palace. The lore of the suicide of the mind suggests that quitting is just a slower form of death. His purpose was the final lesson of the fall. He proves that even a hero who hides in the sanctuary will eventually be claimed by the fog. This reveals the predatory nature of the world. There is no neutral ground. This shows that the history of the crestfallen warrior is a history of the circle, where the warrior returns to the slaughter not as a knight, but as meat. The lore of the Blue-Eye Knight, his former rank, represents the lost nobility of the fall. The lore suggests that he was a member of the King's Guard, a man who swore to protect the throne. By sitting in the Nexus, he is breaking his vows every second. His purpose was the personification of the betrayal. He is the king's failure made visible. This reveals the political disintegration of the All-Ant era. When the Guardians give up, the palace is truly lost. This was the era of the fallen shield. The history of the warrior is the history of the shard, a broken fragment of a kingdom that can never be reassembled. The relationship between the crestfallen warrior and the newbie slayer represents the generational decay. He pities the new slayer because he knows how the story ends. The lore suggests that he has seen dozens of slayers come and go, all of them confident and all of them dead. His purpose was the destroyer of the protagonist syndrome. He tells the hero that they are not special. This reveals the humbling purpose of the Nexus's dialogue. It strips the player of their ego before the demons can strip them of their life. This was the era of the cold reality. The history of the warrior is the history of the sigh, a sound that drowns out the trumpets of war. The act concludes with the empty seat where the warrior once sat. As the slayer looks at the scuff marks on the stone left by his armor, they realize that the crestfallen warrior was the most honest man in the Nexus. He did not lie about mending the world or saving the soul. He simply admitted that he was tired. The purpose of the crestfallen warrior was to be the anchor of the human weakness. He is the part of the slayer that wants to quit. The slayer understands that to succeed, they must kill the crestfallen warrior inside their own heart. The rise of the empty space is the final challenge of the sanctuary, proving that loneliness is a greater demon than Flamelurker. The legacy of the crestfallen warrior in this chapter is the horror of the fading spark. We realize that heroism is a flame that requires constant feeding, and the Nexus is a vacuum that extinguishes the light. The purpose of the workshop of the attrition was to wear down the spirit, and the fall was the silent surrender. As the slayer steps over the ghostly remains of the blue aura, hearing the echo of his final mocking laugh in the vaulted ceiling, they understand that the history of the warrior is the history of the smoke that lingers after the fire of the soul has been smothered by the gray weight of the world. The 6th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Nexus deconstructs the ideological Cold War simmering within the temple's stone walls, exploring the fundamental religious schism between the followers of God and the practitioners of the soul arts. While the Nexus is a sanctuary of unity against the fog, its inhabitants are deeply divided by the source of their power. This is the lore of the magic/miracle conflict. On one side of the central hall sit the disciples of God, who believe their miracles are divine gifts. On the opposite side sit the sages of magic, who recognize their spells as the manipulation of demonic soul energy. The purpose of this geographical divide was the manifestation of the cognitive dissonance. The history of the disciple and the sage is the history of the great lie, where faith and intellect are revealed to be two different languages, used to describe the same demon. The lore of the blasphemous mirror provides the theological horror of the conflict. The followers of Saint Urbain pray to a god they believe exists outside the fog, while Sage Freak and his apprentices study the soul as a scientific resource. The lore suggests that miracles and magic are identical in origin. Both are powered by the Old One. The purpose of the religious divide was the preservation of the human ego. Humanity cannot accept that their God is the beast that is eating them, so they invent a holy source for their power. This reveals the satirical purpose of the Nexus. It is a cathedral where the congregation is worshipping the executioner under different names. The rise of the schism was the final success of the fog, proving that truth is the first victim of the soul hunger. The physical posture of the apostle of God and sage freak's apprentice provides insight into the mutual contempt of the fall. The disciples look upon the mages as degenerate heretics, while the mages look upon the disciples as willfully ignorant fools. The lore of the arrogance of the remnant explains that their purpose is the shielding of the identity. In a world where they have lost everything, their belief system is their only possession. This was the era of the academic and spiritual trenches. This reveals the fractional purpose of the Nexus. Even in the face of extinction, man prefers to argue over definitions than to acknowledge the reality. This shows that the history of the schism is a history of the blindfold, where prayer and formula are both blindfolds used to ignore the void. The relationship between the talismans and the catalysts represents the technological illusion of the fall. The lore suggests that the talisman of God and the wooden catalyst are merely focusing tools for the same energy. The purpose of the tools was the categorization of the chaos. By giving a name to the magic, calling it a miracle, the church makes it socially acceptable. This reveals the political purpose of the Nexus's conflict. Magic is revolutionary and dangerous, while miracles are conservative and controllable. This was the era of the manufactured sanctity. The history of the tools is the history of the branding, where the soul of a demon is rebranded as the light of a saint to secure the loyalty of the knight. Furthermore, the lore of the talisman of beasts represents the shattering of the illusion. This rare item allows the user to cast both miracles and spells, proving they are one and the same. The lore of the heretical truth suggests that the talisman is the true form of the world's power. Its purpose was the exposure of the lie. It merges the god and the beast into a single horrific reality. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the Nexus's schism. The conflict is fake, but the blood it sheds is real. This shows that the history of the disciples and sages is a history of the play acting, where saints and sorcerers are both parasites sucking from the same wound in the world. The lore of Sage Freak's ambition and Saint Urbain's zeal represents the dueling visions of the future. Freak wants to master the soul arts to advance humanity, while Urbain wants to seal the soul arts to restore the faith. The lore suggests that neither vision is viable. Their purpose was the illusory choice. The Nexus allows them to debate because it doesn't matter who wins, the Old One benefits from the spells and the prayers equally. This reveals the futile purpose of the fall's intellectual life. Thought is just vibration in the fog. This was the era of the eloquent despair. The history of the sage is the history of the dead end, where wisdom is just a faster way to madness. The relationship between the disciple of God and the maiden in black represents the hypocrisy of the pious. The disciples despise the maiden for being a demon, yet they use her power to strengthen their faith. The lore suggests that they are addicted to the corruption. Their purpose was the demonstration of the moral decay. They hate the source but love the result. This reveals the sycophantic purpose of the Nexus's religious population. They are beggars at the demon's table, wiping their mouths with scripture. This shows that the history of the disciples is a history of the denial, where purity is a mask worn by gluttons of the soul. The act concludes with the silent coldness between the two camps as the Slayer walks between them. The Slayer is the only one who sees both sides, for the Slayer uses both powers. The purpose of the disciple and the sage was to be the intellectual prison of the world. They confined the truth within dogma and theory. The Slayer realizes that the schism is the Nexus's way of keeping the humans from uniting against the Monumentals. The rise of the magic/miracle debate is the final distraction of the sanctuary, proving that war is the only thing that man will bring into the afterlife. The legacy of the disciple and the sage in this chapter is the horror of the ideological Cold War. We realize that truth is not found in books or altars, but in the silent belly of the beast. The purpose of the workshop of the mind was to fracture the understanding, and the fall was the inability to face the mirror. As the Slayer leaves the echoing arguments of the disciple and the sage behind, hearing the soft, mocking laughter of the maiden in black in the shadows, they understand that the history of the schism is the history of the veil, a veil made of incense and ink that blinds the world to the golden hunger of the end. The 7th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Nexus investigates the internal rot of the temple through the arrival of Yurt, the silent chief. While the Nexus was designed to be a sanctuary of the soul, Yurt represents the parasitic invasion of the waking world's malice into the celestial limbo. Clad in armor that resembles the hardened husk of an insect, he is a professional killer of heroes, sent to ensure that the truth of the soul arts remains buried alongside those who seek to master them. The lore of this era is the lore of the Nexus assassin. His purpose was the surgical extermination of the remnant. He is the antibody of the old order, a shadow sent by the mysterious Mephistopheles to purge the Nexus of anyone who might heal the world. The history of Yurt is the history of the final betrayal, where the sanctuary is revealed to be a fishbowl, where the fish are being hunted by a wolf in black iron. The lore of the gloom of the soul provides the harrowing foundation for Yurt's character. His armor, the gloom set, is described as being blackened by the blood of countless victims. Unlike the knights of Boletaria who fought for duty, Yurt fights for silence. The lore suggests that he is the contractual end of the heroic journey. His purpose was the suppression of the ascension. Every hero the Monumentals summon is a threat to the powers that benefit from the fog. By killing the inhabitants of the Nexus, Yurt ensures that the cycle cannot be resolved by anyone but those who own him. This reveals the political sabotage of the fall. The fog is not just a natural disaster. It is a business that requires enforcers like Yurt to protect the prophet. The rise of the silent chief was the death of the sanctuary's safety. The physical behavior of Yurt, his hidden presence in the upper balconies, provides insight into the predatory patience of the fall. Once released from his cage in the Tower of Latria, he does not attack the Slayer immediately. Instead, he systematically murders the NPCs of the Nexus one by one. The lore of the sequential slaughter explains that his purpose is the dismantling of the support system. He starves the Slayer by removing the blacksmiths, the sages, and the disciples. This was the era of the silent attrition. This reveals the tactical cruelty of the Nexus's invasion. Evil does not always charge through the front door. Sometimes it sits in the corner and waits for its turn. This shows that the history of Yurt is a history of the cancer, where the body of the Nexus is eaten from the inside by its own guest. The relationship between Yurt and the Society of the Shadows, led by Mephistopheles, represents the corporate malice of the world outside. The lore suggests that Yurt is merely a tool for a higher cabal that wants to monopolize the soul arts. Their purpose was the intellectual property of the spirit. They want to kill the teachers, Freak and Urbane, so that knowledge becomes scarcity. This reveals the capitalist horror of the fall. Even as the world ends, there are organizations trying to control the market of salvation. This was the era of the mercenary apocalypse. The history of the assassin is the history of the monopoly, where death is used to eliminate the competition in the afterlife. Furthermore, the lore of the Shotel, Yurt's weapon, represents the circumvention of the defense. The shotel is a curved blade designed to hook around shields. The lore of the unstoppable execution suggests that there is no protection against the silent chief. His purpose was the finality of the strike. In a world where phantoms can resurrect, Yurt represents the permanent end. He kills the soul as well as the body. This reveals the existential purpose of his presence in the Nexus. He is the reminder that nowhere is safe. This shows that the history of Yurt is a history of the hook, which pulls the hero out of their dream and into the cold reality of the grave. The lore of the empty cages in the Nexus, after Yurt has done his work, represents the visual revelation of the loss. When the Slayer returns to find Stockpile Thomas or the Maiden alone in an empty hall, the sanctuary feels colder than the fog. The lore of the desolate refuge suggests that community is the only thing that makes the Nexus endurable. By killing the NPCs, Yurt destroys the moral fabric of the temple. His purpose was the psychological isolation of the Slayer. He wants the hero to be alone with their demons. This reveals the sunder purpose of the fall. The fog separates people until they are weak enough to be devoured. The relationship between Yurt and the Slayer's moral choice represents the mirror of the assassin. If the Slayer chooses to join Mephistopheles and finish Yurt's work, they become the silent chief. The lore suggests that the potential for evil is universal in the Nexus. Their purpose was the corruption of the protagonist. This reveals the irony of the heroism. The Slayer kills demons to save the world, but they kill humans to master the soul. This was the era of the ethical void. The history of the assassin is the history of the infection, where the Slayer inhales the gloom of Yurt until their heart is as black as his plate armor. The act concludes with the final duel between the Slayer and the Silent Chief. As Yurt falls from the balcony, his hollow armor clanging against the stone floor, the Slayer realizes that he was not a demon, but a man who chose to be a monster. The purpose of Yurt the Silent Chief was to be the internal check on the hero. He is the test of the vigilance. The Slayer understands that the Nexus is vulnerable because it is built on trust, and trust is the easiest thing to stab in the back. The rise of the Silent Chief's ghost is the final stain on the sanctuary, proving that paradise can be turned into a slaughterhouse with a single curved blade. The legacy of Yurt in this chapter is the horror of the parasitic invasion. We realize that safety is an illusion that man will always destroy for profit or power. The purpose of the workshop of the assassin was to cleanse the world of hope, and the fall was the shattering of the community. As the Slayer collects the gloom armor from the corpse, hearing the rattle of the soul, escaping the black iron, they understand that the history of Yurt is the history of the roach, a roach that survives the fire and feeds on the crumbs of the apocalypse until there is nothing left to eat but the void. The 8th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Nexus ascends to the highest, most desolate reaches of the spire to examine the digital and spiritual graveyard, known as the Pantheon. While the lower floors of the temple are filled with the clanging of anvils and the murmurs of prayer, the Pantheon is a place of absolute silence and frozen data. It serves as the Hall of Fame for every Slayer who has ever linked their soul to the Nexus and successfully mended the world, or become the demon. The lore of this era is the lore of the ghostly records. Its purpose was the documentation of the cycle. It is a lethal ledger that tracks the statistics of the damned, turning the life and death of a hero into a list of numbers and transparent silhouettes. The history of the Pantheon is the history of the eternal comparison, where the individual struggle is sublimated into a universal scoreboard, proving that in the eyes of the Nexus, a hero is just a high score in an ending game. The lore of the Archive of the Phantoms provides the metaphysical foundation for this cold, celestial library. The Pantheon does not store bodies. It stores echoes. The lore suggests that when a Slayer connects to the online frequency of the fog, their best achievements are uploaded to the Nexus's hard drive. The purpose of the Pantheon was the competitive inspiration. By showing the Slayer the godlike stats of those who came before, the Nexus tricks the current hero into striving for perfection. This reveals the game design purpose of the fall. The Great Ones, or the developers, created a system that feeds on the ambition of the player. The rise of the Pantheon was the death of the personal journey, turning the Save the World mission into a race to the top of a ghostly pillar. The physical environment of the Pantheon, with its vast, empty floors and flickering statues, provides insight into the loneliness of the success within the fall. To reach the Pantheon, one must climb past the Monumentals, leaving the warmth of the fire far behind. The lore of the atmospheric isolation explains that her purpose is the devaluation of the flesh. At the highest point of the Nexus, people are invisible, and only achievements remain illuminated. This was the era of the transparent legend. This reveals the cynical purpose of the sanctuary. The higher you go, the less human you become. This shows that the history of the Pantheon is a history of the abstraction, where blood and sweat are filtered until they are merely flickering blue pixels in a cold, dark room. The relationship between the leaderboards and the soul hunger represents the quantification of the spirit. The lore suggests that the Nexus ranks Slayers based on souls collected, demons slain, and times died. The purpose of the ranking was the validation of the grind. It provides a numerical meaning to the meaningless violence of the hunt. This reveals the psychological trap of the fall. The Nexus gives the Slayer a sense of growth through numbers to disguise the stagnation of the cycle. This was the era of the statistical hero. The history of the Pantheon is the history of the audit, where the Monumentals calculate the ROI, return on investment, of every phantom they summon from the fog. Furthermore, the lore of the ghostly visitors represents the shared delusion of the community. Occasionally, the Slayer sees faint shadows of other players running through the Pantheon. The lore of the temporal bleed suggests that the Nexus exists in multiple realities at once. Its purpose was the illusion of not being alone. By showing the Slayer the ghosts of others, the Nexus numbs the terror of the isolation. This reveals the social engineering purpose of the fall. The fog separates the Slayers physically, but links them spiritually to foster a sense of competition. This shows that the history of the Pantheon is a history of the ghost town, where everyone is visiting, but nobody lives. The lore of the highest throne, the top-ranked Slayer, represents the temptation of the godhood. The lore suggests that the first-place Slayer is the one who has consumed the most souls. Their purpose was the idol of the consumption. They are the perfect demon that the Nexus wants to produce. This reveals the true intent of the Pantheon. It is not a hall of heroes, it is a menu of the strongest spirits for the Old One to eat. This was the era of the prize steer. The history of the Pantheon is the history of the fattening, where prestige is the spice used to season the soul before the final feast. The relationship between the Pantheon and the broken statues represents the erasure of the failure. Slayers who quit or lose their soul, delete their save, disappear from the records. The lore suggests that the Nexus has no room for the weak. Its purpose was the revisionist history. It only remembers the winners, creating a false narrative that victory is possible. This reveals the survivor bias purpose of the fall. The Pantheon hides the millions of dead bodies that the Slayer walked over to reach the top. This shows that the history of the Pantheon is a history of the lie, where the silence of the losers is louder than the cheer of the victors. The act concludes with the silent descent back to the main hall. As the Slayer leaves the glow of the leaderboards and returns to the fading fire, they realize that the Pantheon is the coldest place in the universe. The purpose of the Pantheon was to be the universal mirror of the vanity. It is the proof that man wants to be remembered, even if there is nobody left to remember him. The Slayer understands that being a number on a wall is a poor reward for losing their humanity. The rise of the digital ghost is the final insult of the sanctuary, proving that in the Nexus, even glory is a form of death. The legacy of the Pantheon in this chapter is the horror of the ghostly records. We realize that identity is a data point that can be manipulated by eldritch systems. The purpose of the workshop of the hall was to turn the soul into a score, and the fall was the loss of the story. As the Slayer steps onto the teleport pad to leave the spire, hearing the electronic hum of the Pantheon fading behind them, they understand that the history of the Pantheon is the history of the ghost, a ghost that stands on a pedestal of ice while the world below burns in the fog of the forgotten. The 9th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of the Nexus plunges into the physical and spiritual underworld, hidden beneath the sanctuary's polished stone floor, the true heart of the sacrificial machine. While the upper levels of the spire are dedicated to the preservation of memory and heroic ambition, the space beneath the Nexus is dedicated to the raw reality of the beast. This is the lore of the Below the Nexus. Its purpose was the architectural integration of the Predator. It is the point where the sanctuary ends and the lair begins, revealing that the entire temple is not merely a cradle for the Slayer, but a feeding tube for the Old One. The history of the final descent is the history of the awakening, where the lullaby of the maiden is revealed to be a siren song, leading the most powerful soul in the world directly into the gullet of the ancient horror. The lore of the subterranean womb provides the terrifying foundation for the final area's geography. When the maiden in black finally opens the seal in the center of the Nexus, the floor liquefies or retracts, revealing a vertical drop into a world of gray sand and white fog. The lore suggests that this is the actual origin point of the world. The Nexus was built over the Old One to disguise its presence. Its purpose was the cosmetic burial. By building a holy temple on top of a demon, the Monumentals normalized the apocalypse. This reveals the foundation of deceit inherent in the Nexus. The safety of the temple was always propped up by the breath of the beast below. The rise of the descent was the shattering of the facade, proving that the sanctuary was just the lid of a coffin. The physical environment of the Below the Nexus, the endless beach of ash, provides insight into the ecological void of the fall. This is a place where life has been completely processed. The sand is not earth, but the pulverized remains of previous slayers and kingdoms. The lore of the Shore of the Deep explains that its purpose is the final digestion. This is the stomach of the cosmos. This was the era of the absolute desolation. This reveals the recycling purpose of the Nexus's economy. Souls are collected above and dumped below. This shows that the history of the Below is a history of the excrement, where the beauty of the temple is excreted as the ash of the shore. The rise of the gray sand was the final proof that the Old One has already won the material war. The relationship between the Old One and the Nexus pillars represents the parasitic symbiosis of the fall. The Old One is described as a massive, multi-limbed beast that resembles a living forest of tentacles and moss. The lore suggests that the Nexus is planted into the Old One's back. Its purpose was the integration of the cage. The demon and the temple are one organism. This reveals the symbiotic horror of the world's management. The Monumentals are parasites that live on the Old One, using its energy to keep it asleep. This was the era of the eternal vampire. The history of the Below is the history of the Tangle, where good and evil are knotted together so tightly that they cannot be separated without destroying the universe. Furthermore, the lore of the king's final form, Old King All-Ant, represents the final human result of the Nexus's influence. Within the Below, the Slayer finds All-Ant not as a great warrior, but as a pitiable blob-like creature groveling in the slime. The lore of the evolutionary regret suggests that this is the true form of a soul hoarder. His purpose was the warning of the ultimate greed. He gained the world but lost his shape. This reveals the metamorphosing purpose of the fall. The soul arts do not ascend the human. They liquefy him into bestial matter. This shows that the history of the king is a history of the puddle, where ambition melts the bones and sovereignty dissolves into slime. The lore of the maiden's walk through the fog represents the sacerdotally orchestrated feeding. As the maiden leads the slayer toward the old one, she is acting as the midwife of the demon. The lore of the final lullaby suggests that her purpose is the pacification of the prey. She calms the slayer so that they walk willingly into the deep. This reveals the predatory purpose of her kindness. Love is the spice that makes the slayer's soul palatable to the beast. This was the era of the holy betrayal. The history of the descent is the history of the shepherd, who loves the sheep but leads them to the shears. The relationship between the slayer's decision and the Nexus floor represents the tipping point of the cycle. Once the descent is made, there is no returning to the blacksmiths or the sages. The lore suggests that the below is the point of no return. Its purpose was the commitment of the spirit. The Nexus drops the hero into the mouth of the truth to see if they will swallow or be swallowed. This reveals the ordeal purpose of the fall. The temple is the training ground, and the below is the final examination. This shows that the history of the below is a history of the gravity, which pulls the hero through the floor and into the gut of the world. The act concludes with the silent pulsing of the Old One's breath, as the slayer stands before the eldritch mass. Hearing the low harmonic hum of the fog vibrating through their boots, they realize that the Nexus was just a viewing gallery for the main event. The purpose of the Below the Nexus was to be the universal unmasking. It is the place where the lies of the temple die. The Slayer understands that the Monumentals were afraid of this place because it shows that God is just a hungry forest that dreams of nothingness. The rise of the awakened beast is the final movement of the sanctuary, proving that the floor of the Nexus was the only thing protecting the Slayer from the truth of their own hunger. The legacy of the Below the Nexus in this chapter is the horror of the physical underworld. We realize that reality is a thin crust floating on a sea of teeth. The purpose of the workshop of the descent was to bridge the gap between the prey and the predator, and the fall was the liquefaction of the boundary. As the Slayer walks into the mist of the Old One's throat, hearing the soft, wet thud of the seal closing above them, they understand that the history of the Below is the history of the throat, a throat that swallows the temple, the hero, and the sun until there is nothing left but the gray silence of the shore. The 10th and final chapter in our chronicle of the Nexus reaches the ultimate outcome of the temple's existence, centering on the shattering of the cycle and the resolution of the soul arts. This is the lore of the final choice. After the Slayer has descended into the bowels of the Old One and defeated the shriveled remains of King Allant, the Nexus prepares for its final function. The sanctuary was never meant to last forever. It was a temporary dam built to hold back an eternal tide. The purpose of this final moment was the determination of the universal trajectory. The history of the dissolution is the history of the mended world or the new demon, where the hero must decide if the Nexus was a cradle of salvation or a chrysalis of a new nightmare. This is the moment where the stone finally crumbles, and the spirit is either returned to the earth or elevated to the throne of the beast. The lore of the mending of the world represents the conservative victory of the Monumentals design. If the Slayer allows the Maiden in Black to lull the Old One back into its eternal slumber, the Nexus begins to deactivate. The lore suggests that this is the natural exhalation of the world. The purpose of the mending was the restoration of the mortality. By sealing the soul arts, the Slayer deletes the magic and the miracles from the world, returning humanity to a state of physical frailty. This reveals the bitter mercy of the fall. Saving the world means destroying the wonder. The rise of the morning sun over the fogless kingdom was the final silence of the spire, proving that peace is only possible when the hunger of the soul is starved by the removal of the power. The lore of the new demon represents the evolutionary betrayal of the Slayer. If the hero kills the maiden and claims the soul of the old one for themselves, the Nexus transforms from a sanctuary into a throne room. The lore suggests that the Slayer has become the primeval demon. Their purpose was the realization of the ambition. They did not end the scourge, they inhabited it. This reveals the parasitic inevitability of the fall. The Nexus was always waiting for a master who was strong enough to rule the dark. This was the era of the luminous terror. This shows that the history of the choice is a history of the mirror, where the hero looks at the beast and sees themselves. The rise of the new demon was the final failure of the seal, turning the archstones into fangs that will eat the rest of the cosmos. The physical dissolution of the Nexus during the ending provides insight into the planned obsolescence of the fall. As the old one retreats or ascends, the endless stairs of the temple begin to collapse into the void. The lore of the structural erasure explains that its purpose was the destruction of the evidence. Once the choice is made, the Nexus is no longer necessary. This was the era of the falling masonry. This reveals the vacuum purpose of the sanctuary. It was a space between spaces that folds up and disappears when the story is over. This shows that the history of the Nexus is a history of the dream, which vaporizes the moment the dreamer wakes up or becomes the nightmare. The relationship between the Monumental's death and the final decision represents the extinction of the old order. Regardless of the Slayer's choice, the living pillars finally turn to dust. The lore suggests that they were holding their breath for 1,000 years. Their purpose was the handoff of the reality. They gave the world to the Slayer and then ceased to be. This reveals the orphan purpose of the fall's conclusion. The new world, or the new nightmare, has no parents. This was the era of the pure autonomy. The history of the Monumentals is the history of the scaffolding, which is torn down once the building, the Slayer's soul, is finished. The lore of the maiden's final words represents the final benediction of the machine. If the world is mended, she thanks the Slayer for freeing her. If the Slayer becomes the demon, she accepts her death as the cost of her nature. The lore of the Stoic resolution suggests that her purpose was the witnessing of the end. She is the only one who sees the truth and does not judge. This reveals the impartial purpose of the Nexus's heart. The temple does not care if the world is saved or damned. It only cares that the cycle is completed. This shows that the history of the maiden is a history of the function, which runs its program until the final line of code. The relationship between the Slayer's soul and the new world represents the legacy of the violence. The Slayer carries the souls of millions into the morning or the throne. The lore suggests that the Nexus has permanently altered the human spirit. Even if the fog is gone, the memory of the hunger remains. Its purpose was the permanent scarring. This reveals the traumatic purpose of the fall. The Nexus was a surgery that saved the patient, but removed their ability to feel peace. This was the era of the haunted recovery. The history of the choice is the history of the ghost, which lingers in the heart of every survivor. The act concludes with the silent fading of the Nexus into the ether. As the screen darkens and the sound of the wind replaces the chants of the temple, the Slayer realizes that the Nexus was the true demon all along. It was a machine that ate heroes to produce choices. The purpose of the Nexus was to be the universal crucible. It melted the world down to its purest essence and asked a human to shape the shard. The rise of the final outcome is the final breath of the sanctuary, proving that nothing is eternal, not the temple, not the king, and not the scourge. The legacy of the Nexus in this final chapter is the horror of the final choice. We realize that power is a sentence and freedom is a loss. The purpose of the workshop of the end was to kill the past, and the fall was the dissolution of the meaning. As the slayer stands in the aftermath, hearing the soft, final rattle of the maiden's bell in the distance, they understand that the history of the Nexus is the history of the door, a door that closed forever on the old world, leaving only the vast, uncertain morning of a soulless earth or the infinite night of a new god.